Chapter 4. Tactical Dispositions. As the sun set behind the shadow heights, the orcs of the camp began to light the fires for the night. Harguth and Zul'jin sat by one of the fires, surrounded by a group of young orclings who were up well past their bedtime. The young orcs were wide-eyed and curious, eager to hear stories of battles and adventures from the two chief orcs. The fire crackled and sparks danced into the night sky. The warmth of the flames and the companionship of their tribe helped to ease the weight of the responsibility the chief orcs carried. As they sat there, the orange and red embers of the fire casting a warm light on their faces, the two chief orcs shared stories of their battles and adventures with the young orclings, who listened attentively, their eyes wide with wonder and excitement. They knew that the war ahead would not be easy, and that they would need to rely on each other if they were to emerge victorious. And as the young orclings drifted off to sleep, the chief orcs knew that they were the future of the tribe, and it was their responsibility to guide and protect them. "It is known," Zul'jin said, gesturing to the fire and nodding. "We must use our knowledge of tactics and strategy if we are to succeed. Our ancestors taught us that we must consider all aspects of a battle, from terrain to enemy numbers, in order to make wise decisions." Harguth gripped the armrests of his chair. "Indeed, we must be mindful of the environment and use it to our advantage. We must also remember that the fate of any battle ultimately lies with the gods." The orclings around the fire stirred at the mention of the gods, their eyes wide as they listened intently. One of them spoke up, her voice small but determined. "Will Tempest be with us, grandfather?" Harguth smiled warmly and patted the young one's head. "Yes, my child. Tempest will be with us. She will guide us in our battles and protect us from harm." He glanced at Zul'jin before adding, "But we must still be wise in our choices and take care not to underestimate our enemies." Harguth gestured to the fire. We must take whatever steps necessary to protect ourselves and our people. We must make sure that no harm comes to them," he said firmly. One of the orclings spoke up. "But what about taking advantage of the enemy's weaknesses?" Both Harguth and Zul'jin looked at the young orcling in surprise, before breaking into a smile. Yes," Harguth said, "we must also be bold and take advantage of any opportunity that presents itself. If we can outsmart our opponents, then victory is all but assured." The two chiefs shared a look of understanding before Harguth added, "To secure ourselves against defeat lies in our own hands, but the opportunity of defeating the enemy is provided by the enemy himself." He paused for a moment to let the wisdom of his words sink in, as the orclings around them nodded. The sounds of the night forest and the crackling of the fire filled the air as they continued their discussion. "The wise orc knows that victory is not always certain, but we can still strive for it," Harguth said and looked up at Zul'jin. "We must use our cunning and courage if we are to succeed." The orclings began to whisper excitedly between themselves. Harguth smiled and waved his hand, silencing them. "Yes, courage and bravery are both important," he said. "But more important still is strategy. Our ancestors taught us that a battle is won before it is fought." He paused, looking into the flames. "If we plan carefully and anticipate our enemy's moves, then we will have the upper hand. Hence the saying," Harguth began, his voice low and thoughtful. He gestured to the fire with one hand, "One may know how to conquer without being able to do it." The two young orclings nodded in agreement, their eyes wide with wonder at the wisdom of their elders. The chorus of night forest creatures filled the air. The two chiefs discussed further, while the orclings listened intently, taking in every word and committing them to memory. "Indeed," Harguth said, using his hands to gesture as he spoke. "We must be wise in our strategy and use the terrain to our advantage. We must also remember that even the most carefully laid plans may not always be enough to ensure victory." He grunted, then gestured to the fire. "But, if we are to prepare ourselves for whatever fate has in store, we must be ever vigilant, never forgetting the lessons of our ancestors." The orclings around the fire murmured their agreement, eyes filled with admiration. Zul'jin smiled at the young ones, then added, "Let us never forget that victory can only come from within. We must be careful not to underestimate our enemy, for if we do we shall surely be defeated. We must also use our strength wisely and never overestimate our abilities." Zul'jin said and glanced at the orclings who were still wide awake and listening intently, and smiled. "Our ancestors taught us that it is better to act from a position of strength than one of weakness." Zul'jin said, gestured to the fire with a grunt. We must take great care in our strategy if we are to succeed. We must remember the wisdom of our ancestors and be ever vigilant in our battle plans. He paused for a moment as one of the orclings shifted restlessly, then added, the outcome of any battle lies in the hands of fate, but we must do all we can to ensure victory. Harguth nodded, his eyes flickering to the orclings before turning back to Zul'jin. The crackling of the fire and the chirping of the night's creatures filled the silence between them, punctuated by the occasional yawn from one of the orclings. It is no use to judge victory by the eyes of the common folk, Harguth said. We must look beyond what is visible and trust in our wits and strategy. Zul'jin added, yes, it is important that we have faith in our plans and never underestimate our enemy's capabilities. He looked around the fire at the orclings who were listening intently and added, in war, there is no room for complacency or arrogance. We cannot rely solely on strength of arms, but must also use cunning and strategy to win this war. Zul'jin said, gesturing with his hands as he spoke. As Harguth agreed, one of the orclings yawned and snuggled closer to him. He smiled at the small orc and ruffled its hair before continuing. The outcome of any battle lies in the hands of fate. We must trust that Tempest will be with us in our struggle, and that our plans will be successful. Yes, it is true that we must not be fooled by appearances, Harguth said, gesturing to the fire as sparks flew up into the night sky. We must look beyond what we can see with our eyes and use our wits to find success. He then glanced at the orclings, who had been listening intently to the conversation, and added, but we must also remember that our greatest strength lies in our unity. Zul'jin hummed, his eyes twinkling in the firelight. Indeed, our ancestors taught us well. We must use our collective strength if we are to succeed. He then nodded to the orclings, who had been watching the exchange with wide eyes, and said, and you young ones must remember this too. Even the smallest of us can make a difference in a battle. The wise orc knows that the easiest victory is not always the most honorable, Harguth said, gesturing to the orclings around the fire. We must be careful and use cunning tactics if we are to emerge victorious. Indeed, we must also remember to make use of our resources wisely. We cannot afford to waste time or energy on foolish pursuits, Zul'jin said. We must be wise in our decisions, Harguth said, pointing at the fire with his hand. Victory does not always come from strength and courage alone, but from careful planning and strategy. He paused for a moment, before adding, our victories will bring us both wisdom and honor. Zul'jin gave the orclings a knowing look and smiled. Yes, my young ones. We must remember that we are fighting for a greater cause, and that we must be prepared to make sacrifices if necessary. We must make no mistakes if we are to succeed. We must be as wise and cunning as our ancestors, for it is only through their wisdom that we can be victorious, Zul'jin said. One of the orclings let out a soft snore, causing the two chiefs to chuckle. Harguth then reached over and gently nudged the orcling awake. Come now, young one, he said, smiling. You must listen to our discussion, just as our ancestors did. He turned back to Zul'jin and continued, our strategy must be flawless and precise if we are to win this war. It is true, Zul'jin said, gesturing as the flames of the fire danced in front of him. We must be sure to use our strengths and weaknesses to our advantage. We must know when to attack, when to retreat, and when to stand our ground. The two orc chiefs were interrupted by a chorus of yawns from the young orclings that had been listening intently to their conversation. Harguth smiled and said, yes, my children, it is past your bedtime. You must get some rest if we are to have any hope of winning this war. He then turned back to Zul'jin and added, but first, let us remember the ancient wisdom of our ancestors, he who strikes first, strikes twice. Zul'jin stoked the fire with a stick. We must be ever vigilant in our battle plans. We must take into account every possible outcome and prepare for any eventuality. He paused for a moment as the orclings gathered around the fire, their wide eyes reflecting the flames. We must never underestimate our foes and must always be ready to act at a moment's notice. Harguth nodded, his hands gesturing in the air. Yes, we must make sure that our strategy is sound. We must also remember that no matter how prepared we are, the outcome of any battle lies in the hands of fate. The orclings murmured in agreement and Harguth gave them a knowing smile. Zul'jin gestured to the fire. Our ancestors taught us that a leader must cultivate the moral law and follow strict methods and discipline if they are to succeed. The orclings grumbled quietly, tired but still eager to hear more. Harguth smiled at them and nodded, before continuing. With clever tactics, we can gain an edge over our enemies and come out victorious. It is true that for any battle, we must remember to measure, estimate, calculate, and balance our chances if we are to emerge victorious, Zul'jin said. We must always consider the 5 elements of war, Harguth said, gesturing with his hands as he spoke. Measurement, estimation of quantity, calculation, balancing of chances, and victory. To be successful in battle, we must master all of these elements. A chorus of crickets sang in the background, a reminder of the night's stillness. It is said, Harguth began, that an army victorious will always outweigh the routed one. We must be sure to use our strength and numbers to our advantage. He paused, looking around at the orclings who were watching wide-eyed. We must also remember that even a single grain of wheat can tip the scales in our favor. The fire crackled and sparks flew up into the night sky as the 2 chiefs discussed their plans for battle. Occasionally, the orclings would make small sounds and grunts of agreement, reminding them of their presence. The conversation continued until late into the night, both men determined to formulate the perfect strategy for victory. It is known, Zul'jin stated solemnly and tended the fire, that we must take utmost care in our strategy if we are to prevail. We must heed the wisdom of our ancestors and be ever vigilant in our battle plans. The orclings stirred, making a small noise at the mention of their ancestors. Harguth glanced at them with a fondness before continuing, we must pay close attention to our surroundings. We must also remember that the outcome of any battle lies in the hands of fate. He paused for a long moment before adding, let us remain steadfast and trust in our strength and courage. The 2 chiefs shared a look of understanding, while the orclings looked up at them with admiration. With a nod of agreement, they all settled back around the fire, listening to the sounds of the night forest and the crackle of the flames. As the stories came to an end and the fire began to die down, the young orclings slowly drifted off to sleep, lulled by the soothing sounds of the fire and the comforting presence of their chief orcs. Harguth and Zul'jin sat there for a while, watching over them, making sure they were all safe and sound. The weight of responsibility they carried was heavy, but they knew that they had to be strong for their tribe and for the young orclings who looked up to them.